Christopher Tienken is an assistant professor in the Department of Education, Leadership, Management, and Policy at Seton Hall University. Tienken's research interests include school reform issues such as neoliberal influences in education policymaking, the influence of curriculum design and development on student achievement, and the use of high-stakes standardized tests as decision-making tools to determine school quality and student learning. He was awarded the Kappa Delta Pi Truman Kelly Award for Outstanding Scholarship in 2013 and received the National Staff Development Council Award for Best Research in 2008. His new book with co-author Don Orlick is titled The School Reform Landscape, Fraud, Myth, and Lies. Tienken has ongoing research collaborations with colleagues at the Università degli Studi Roma Tre, Rome, University of Rome, Italy. Please excuse me if I completely butchered that. The University of Catania, Sicily, and he was named as a visiting scholar at both universities. So if we could welcome Christopher Tienken with his paper on Common Core Creativity, What Are Pre-Service Teachers Learning?
My colleague and I took a look, or started to take a look at this idea of what are pre-service teachers learning, because as we heard this morning, of course, the way we prepare teachers is going to have a large impact on down the line in terms of what our students receive. So if we're preparing teachers to deliver, let's say, standardized content through standardized methods, we can see there's going to be an issue with that in terms of the way our students are learning, what they're maybe able to do later on down the road. So we started to take a look of, in terms of Common Core states that have adopted the Common Core, the influence of that on the teacher education programs. And so our initial idea was to structure our work as an argument or a commentary. And as you probably recognize from reading it, it's still in the formative stages. We're trying to work out our ideas. And we're kind of going back and forth between making this accessible to practitioners who may not be as comfortable reading research literature or theoretical articles, and then also trying to make it impactful to those in the academy who prepare practicing teachers. So we're struggling to find a balance in terms of the best way to do that. And maybe the fact that we're trying to serve two masters creates some of that tension internally in terms of what we're trying to do with our work. So I had suggested that if you have read it or you're going to read it again, these are reading aids that might assist you in making it through the paper and a little more enjoyable for you. So as you choose. But in terms of the context of what we're looking at, the macro political and the political rhetoric is focused very much on this idea of global competitiveness. So it's clearly in the economic realm of what's going on, and that's trickling down through the corporate interests and their think tanks, which continually put out this idea of competitiveness, being globally competitive, economic competitiveness, this idea that U.S. students are somehow lagging, and that term comes up quite often, lagging those peers around the world. And so you see things like this come out regularly from the Chamber of Commerce, Business Roundtable, Hoover, Fordham, so on and so forth, kind of continually portraying this myth of a lag. And at the same time, they place a premium on this idea of creativity and strategic thinking as necessary tools for kids to advance in the global economy. The corporate arena is full of self-produced publications, and when you look at the recommendations at the end of these things in terms of teacher education and public education, it always comes back to more creativity, more strategic thinking. So what usually happens is somewhere in those reports there's usually a reference to Pisa Scores or TIM scores as some kind of evidence that American students are not prepared for the global economy. Now, of course, they don't discuss the issues with those tests, and that those tests don't actually measure creativity or innovation or some of the other skills that's necessary in an innovation economy, but they do use the ranks. And of course, there's Simpson's paradox involved in those rankings. For those of you who've been through and using the TIMS data tool or the PISA data tool, you know that as soon as you start to disaggregate the data at the poverty level of the school in which the students attended, U.S. students in schools that mirror poverty levels in other high-performing countries like Scandinavia, we generally perform at the top of the world. Our issue is, of course, as the dean spoke, was we also have a very long tail in our system, and so we have children attending schools with 50% more poverty, unlike other industrialized countries in the world. But nevertheless, these rankings are used, of course, to aid the rhetoric. So there's these ongoing claims that public school graduates lack the creativity and strategic thinking to be globally competitive. Our current education commissioner, of course, called it education stagnation at the release of the last set of Pisa scores, and teachers are constantly derided that they're not preparing students for the future. So enter the corporate solution. And of course, we saw this very overtly in A Nation at Risk, but even a report before that in 1978 had called for, the National Council on Basic Skills or something like that, called for more, higher standards, testing, accountability, so on and so forth. And then, of course, Nation at Risk came out. And since then, we've had our education president's business roundtables with the Bush 1 administration, Education Summit, of course, in Charleston, which led us to Goals 2000. President Clinton picked up where George Bush 1 left off. And then, of course, we're all living with the ramifications of NCLB. All based on this idea of a performance guarantee in terms of funding. And that's a shift. When you look at the original inception of ESEA, it was really an input guarantee philosophy in terms of trying to make sure that inputs or funding or resources was more equalized. And then you start to you see a drastic change in that language in Nation at Risk, where it becomes all about the output. And really, Goals 2000, Educate America Act solidified that philosophy, that performance guarantee philosophy in education policy making at the national level. And of course, that's now trickled down to the state level. So hence, we end up in a performance guarantee system. You end up with performance guarantee solutions, which are curriculum standards for performance. They're output expectations, really. And then standardized measures to make sure they're being implemented with fidelity. Yes, Common Core, we have over 40 states now involved in that, although there is some pushback, but Common Core is the de facto performance guarantee tool, as are SBAC, PARC, and some of the AIR tests that are aligned to the Common Core. So you now have basically the perfect mousetrap with the funding. The funding is connected to the performance. The performance is dictated by these Common Core standards and monitored, of course, through the testing. And the results now in many states, if you have an NCLB waiver in your state, you basically signed off and agreed to tie the results of these standardized tests to teacher evaluation. So hence you're seeing influences of that in the teacher education programs, because the test, like in New Jersey, we're what's known as a PARC state. The test now, and the makeup of the test, the framework of the PARC test, has now begun to infiltrate the actual teacher preparation realm, because teachers are being prepared to deliver and teach to the PARC test, because their ratings in New Jersey and other states are now tied to the results on that. I think you all saw what happened in New York now, with the governor declare that 50% of a teacher's effectiveness rating is going to be tied to the output on their state tests. So in terms of the corporate solution, Common Core is marketed as superior to all other previous standards, and their corporate supporters in their think tanks consistently put out reports. The Fordham Institute is one that did their 2010 review of all state standards, and they found that the vast majority were inferior to Common Core. And the claim is, of course, Common Core will make all students college and career ready if we can implement them with fidelity. So our colleague here, Anthony Cody, a colleague of mine, Stan Karp, and some others have actually traced the corporate roots of Common Core, the genesis, if you will. And of course, you see all the regular players in this debate and where the Common Core actually came from. There's no surprises there. Not a lot of teachers were involved at all. The teachers who were involved were somewhat of rubber stamps or inclined to go along with this philosophy of a performance guarantee anyway. So the implied idea here is Common Core provides for better development of creativity and innovation because it is being offered as the solution to the global economic lag. So basically what we're being told is this set of prepackaged standards will deliver output in terms of creativity and innovation if only teacher education programs would get on board and teach their candidates to implement this thing with fidelity, whatever that looks like. So teacher education now has yet another target on it, and that is the effective delivery of Common Core and what kinds of teacher education programs can do that better. Is it outside of the university or within the traditional teacher prep realm? So you're seeing things pop up now across the country, like this mathematics teacher education partnership, where you have faculty from 38 universities across the country and teachers all looking at ways to how best teach and present the Common Core to their teacher education candidates. So we've kind of skipped the step where we actually question whether the Common Core is effective or a good idea. We kind of jumped right to implementation and the best way to do that. And so you're seeing that idea spread across the country in terms of we're not questioning whether the Common Core is superior, we're just moving to implementation. And so one of the things that we tried to do was question the notion of, is the Common Core superior to previous state standards that might have existed? So we're going back and trying to fill in that step that was skipped. So this idea that blindly accepting these things in the teacher education program that's troubling to us. We were looking to teacher education programs to perhaps provide some more evaluation or critique of the Common Core standards, and what we're seeing is just pure implementation of them. So we're arguing that that's fine if you need to include these things in your program for some state regulation. Like states like New Jersey routinely send out edicts to teacher education programs in terms of what they must include, and PARC and Common Core are some of those things. And so, yes, you might have to address those, but we're also arguing that teacher education preparation faculty also have a responsibility to spend some time analyzing the standards compared to what they used to have, to see where perhaps strengths and weaknesses exist so that they can at least properly instruct their teacher ed candidates on how to deal with the potential weaknesses in the core, which I don't think is happening, at least in my state. It's more focused on implementation. So we looked at, in the paper we present some prior literature and comparisons that have been done. There haven't really been a lot of comparisons done in terms of the Common Core related to other state standards in terms of creativity and strategic thinking. We used the Webb's Depth of Knowledge tool to do that. And so the existing literature that is out there, although thin, and our work showed that the standards are, at least in New Jersey, we presented the standards were actually superior in terms of creativity and strategic thinking. Some of the literature that we looked at, it's not all of it, but some of it in terms of trying to wrap our head around creativity and strategic thinking came from some of these authors and studies. And what we found, and when you're trying to pin down a definition of creativity, that there's not really one definition. We looked at many and tried to come up with themes. Sternberg gave us one in terms of this idea as creativity as purpose or problem focused. And Albert and Runco gave us creativity as something used to improve humanity, and then creativity through collaboration and communication. What we found in terms of the studies on these things really depends on how you view creativity, the lens that you use to view creativity. And there's basically two types of studies that took place in the literature. They either judge the language of the standards, much like you would judge the language of a teacher's objective through the lens of Bloom's. Some of the studies just did that. They read the standards in the core curriculum content standards, kind of applied a Bloom's verb to it, and came up with the conclusion that yes, the Common Core includes much more analysis. There's much more higher level thinking in the Common Core than previous standards. And we questioned that method because some of those studies did not dig below the surface to think about, it's not the language of the standard, it's the expected output by the student that is going to determine whether there's creativity and strategic thinking involved. You can have analysis in a standard, but if, for example, many of the literature standards in the Common Core, oh yes, students analyze, but they analyze for one right answer. They analyze for an author's purpose. They analyze for an author's theme. That's not so much higher thinking in terms of creativity and strategic thinking. At the end of the day, it's more convergent than divergent. And so that's one of the issues we found with the previous studies that were done, was their conception of creativity and their conception of this ambiguous term called rigor. And they basically just went through and used Bloom's verbs and said, oh, there's more analysis here than here, therefore Common Core is better, previous state standards not as good. And many of these studies that took place only analyzed what's called the macro standard. There's generally statements, as you know, involved with standards, and then there's substandards below those. And many of these studies never went below the substandard to look at what students are actually required to produce, which is an indicator of the kind of cognitive processes that they're going through. So for example, in New Jersey, our previous mathematics standards, this would be an example of a macro standard. Previous studies would stop right here and analyze the macro. And they would come up with some kind of a cognitive description of what's going on here. But one of the things that we tried to do, and we looked for this in the literature and we didn't see a lot of it, what we tried to do is we went into the substandards. And in that one standard alone, there's 4 different categories of mathematical work and mathematical thinking that's going on, and 40 specific indicators for student output. So what we did is we dove below the macro standard and went in and used Webb's tool to look at the underlying expectations for students to come up and arrive at our findings. And we didn't find a lot of literature like that already exists, because once again, much of the existing literature stopped here. And in terms of the studies that exist on the Common Core, the Florida CPOM study is probably maybe the most well-known or the biggest study. And what they did there was they took an entire section of the Common Core, like reading literature. There's 10 subcomponents in reading literature in grades 9 and 10. And so they took all the 10 subcomponents and put it together to create a macro and just rated that macro, the 10 subcomponents put together. They didn't separate them and look at the actual expectations for student work and student thinking individually. So they have a much more generic rating. And once again, we tried to go in and rate them at the substandard level. And so we used a tool that allows for the analysis of opportunities for creative and strategic thinking. That was the Webb's alignment tool. Some of you are probably very familiar with that. And we kind of looked through the lens of opportunity to think. And what level were these opportunities provided? So Webb's, there's 4 different areas that Webb's can be used. Okay, so you have categorical concurrence, depth of knowledge, range of knowledge, and balance representation. Webb is probably most well known for being used to determine the match between what the standards say and the corresponding assessments. Okay, that's not what we were doing. We were looking in terms of the depth of knowledge consistency within the standards. We weren't concerned with alignment to assessments. We were concerned to what's actually packed into the Common Core. And so we focused on depth of knowledge, and we looked at the extent to which these cognitive demands in the content are the same to what people would require to do on an assessment. But we didn't look at the assessment, okay? Because our thinking is, if we can look at what might be required on an assessment, we're aligning that to student output. And at the end of the day, we want to see the type of cognitive demand required for student output to make the determination if there's creative or strategic thinking. And at the classroom level, it is in fact the substandards that form the basis for instruction. Because as a teacher, when I'm given a macro standard, within that macro, you saw there was 40 different indicators. So what the teachers are doing, they're trying to unpack those macros into those teachable parts that they need to deliver to students. So that's why we dove down to the substandard basis, because that's where it's actually impacting the teacher practice and the students, and of course the intended and enacted curriculum. That intended curriculum is more or less at the macro level, but the enacted curriculum is at the substandard level when we're seeing it in the classroom. So we were looking at the 4 levels of thinking in the depth of knowledge. The lowest levels would be declarative and procedural. And of course, the areas where Webb identifies creative thinking can be fostered is at strategic and extended thinking opportunities, levels 3 and 4. So the opportunities for creativity are most often found in levels 3 and 4. Now, just because a standard is rated at a level 3 or 4, of course, doesn't mean that creative or strategic thinking is automatically going to happen. That's where the art and science of teaching also comes in. But of course, we were unable to look at that level at the classroom level. Okay, so here's just some descriptors for those of you who haven't seen Webb's in a while in terms of level 3 and 4. Okay, and we believe, when we look at these descriptions, and then we look back at the way that creativity is described for educational purposes, we believe it is these 3 levels that best align to what the literature is saying. And that's one of the reasons we chose it as our tool. So in terms of analysis, we used dual coders and a read-behind method, and trying to get agreement. We had someone to adjudicate differences in ratings, a third party to adjudicate differences, to add to the reliability of what happened there in the analysis phase. And then just some quick results that we found were the Common Core standards much higher in procedural and declarative thinking. And then, of course, much lower in the opportunities in areas 3 and 4. So if you're this is math, and the same kind of thing happens in language arts in New Jersey. Okay, this is in relation to the New Jersey standards. We can't say if this happens in all 50 states. I doubt it does, but there's room for more research there. But you're seeing, at least with New Jersey, more opportunities in the previous New Jersey curriculum for teachers to take advantage of strategic and extended thinking. So our issue becomes, if we're training teachers in teacher ed programs to implement the Common Core with fidelity, then what are we really training them to do? Is it in the area of strategic and creative thinking, or is it really looks like more process and declarative thinking? So then we're going to run into some tension between this manufactured crisis, perhaps, of creativity and innovation lag, and the solution. The solution doesn't match the reality, it seems, here. Okay, so we come back to this idea that creativity can't be standardized. There's this thing called collateral learning. Dewey was talking about the collateral curriculum and collateral learning, and we're afraid that if we do teach teachers to implement these things with fidelity, that the collateral curriculum and collateral learning could potentially be further extinguished, which could then extinguish more of the creative and strategic thinking. Okay? And we're just asking teacher ed faculty to not assume the CCS are superior in any way. Okay? But even if they are, let's say they are. Let's say you're in a state where the Common Core is in some way superior, however you want to define that. It's still not providing the opportunities for creative and strategic thinking on a large scale. So even if it's superior, if your goal is creative and strategic thinking, then this is the wrong solution for you. And that needs to be brought to the table. So we're thinking maybe if teacher ed programs are under a mandate to teach the Common Core, that perhaps they should also teach teachers how to innovate it and bring in creative opportunities and strategic thinking opportunities, for them to teach teachers how to teach creatively, to allow space for creative thinking in the classroom. And of course, some of the most common examples would be more work in teacher ed for using problem-based learning, because problem-based learning could be one way to unstandardize the Common Core. Okay, so in terms of moving forward with our thinking on this paper, because it is clearly a work in progress, I think we need to go back and also introduce into our paper the idea, some traditionalist views of curriculum in terms of this idea of knowledge transmission, efficiency, outcome predictability, and so forth, to further explain the Common Core and contradict it more to creativity, because the Common Core rests on a foundation that we really don't explain in our paper, and I think we need to go back and do that. I also think we need to bring in, if we're going to talk about traditionalist view of curriculum, we also need to bring in this idea of the doctrine of specificity and the disciplines doctrine that really took off after the Woods Hole Conference in 1950 to explain kind of the lineage and the philosophical underpinnings, perhaps, of standardization, which we don't do in the paper, and show how the doctrine of specificity, for example, is kind of opposed to this idea of creativity and the collateral curriculum, because the doctrine of specificity will actually push down on the creative curriculum and narrow opportunities for collateral learning. And of course, I think we need to explain how, after 20 years of a doctrine of specificity, we've already been through this experiment in the United States, and it didn't work out. And we don't really take that on too much in the paper, and I think that would be good for teacher ed faculty to be aware of that as well. And I think it would provide more support and deeper considerations of the implications that we provide. Because right now I feel they're more at the superficial level, and I think if we provide a little more construct, a little more framework, we'll be able to flesh out some better implications on that. So at this time, I am prepared to be the guinea pig, and I think I'm going to sit down for that so I can actually take notes on what you say to me. But I want to thank you for being an attentive community. Thank you.